Yep, we're all set recording. Sorry about that.
Thanks so much. No problem. Thank you so much. Enjoy.
Thank you.
All right.
Sorry about that, Talaya. The floor is yours.
All right, let's try, second time is a charm.
We always have to have a glitch to start off a meeting.
Yeah. Get my presentation back. Uh-oh, sorry. 1 second. All right. Welcome, everyone. Again, my name is Talaya. I use she, her pronouns. Just a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I'm from Dallas, Texas, also from Waco, Texas. I'm from both places. I spent the first half of my childhood in Waco. I think there's like a show on HGTV about Waco. It's not true, okay? Just so you know. And then I went to college in Dallas at the University of Texas at Arlington. Where I have a bachelor's of science in exercise science, but I actually hate exercising. So my master's degree is in education. And then I'm currently working on my doctorates in education and learning and organizational change from Baylor University, who, like, fun fact, last night won the NCAA championship. So go Bears, sick 'em. That's what people say in Texas. So I think that's, sick 'em or whatever. So just a little bit about me. I currently work at Northeastern University as a residence director. And so I'm in my office right now. So if you hear students clanking on my window, it's because I'm in a residence hall right now, but hopefully they'll be fine. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about unlearning bias and understanding our social identities and implicit bias, okay? So let's see. All right, so just a few outcomes for the presentation today. We are going to be able to understand our social identities that we hold, as well as socialization. We're also going to be able to define implicit bias and how it manifests itself. And then we're also going to learn how to, or create some tools on how to unlearn that bias that we all have, okay? So just a loose agenda. We should be able to get to everything, but if not, we're going to talk in a second about continuing our learning, but just a loose agenda. So we're going to go over some community agreements. We'll go over some terminology. I have an identity wheel activity for us, and then we're going to talk a little bit about implicit bias, cycle of socialization and liberation, and then we're going to have some discussion to kind of bring all of those topics back together. All right. So just some kind of ground rules for our session. The first one is to let life happen. We already see, things happen that are beyond our control, but we're in a virtual world. So, like, it's okay. If your cat walks across the screen or your baby cries, like, let it happen. Just, try to be as present as you can, but it's totally okay. Like, we're all humans living in a human unpredictable world. So share only your experiences, not the experiences of others. What's said here stays here, but what's learned here leaves here. So we're gonna have some conversations today about some things that might be personal, and you want to learn the lesson from those things, but please make sure that you're not sharing anyone else's stories beyond this session. And then expect unfinished business. As my friend Faustina, who is also here, one thing that she says is, like, I'm here to plant the seeds. It's on you all to water them and grow them and nurture them. So there will be unfinished business. There will be questions that you have at the end of the session. And I challenge you to continue learning, continue growing, continue seeking out sources and things to kind of help you water those seeds. Okay. Is everybody good with those agreements?
Very good.
Perfect. All right. So let's get started. So it's just some language, some terms we're going to learn today. So we're going to start with personal identities. Personal identities are identities that are, like, unique to you as an individual, right? So, like, parent, teacher, sister. I'm actually none of those things. Let's see. I'm a student. Yep. I'm a daughter. So, like, that's something that's a personal identity that I hold, right? Social identities are they're a little bit different. So it's like your class, your ethnicity, your gender, your religion. So those are like social groups within society. For the purposes of the conversation today, we're going to talk about social identities, and we'll get into a little bit more specific about what those can look like for you. We're also going to talk about implicit bias. We'll get into that a little bit more later, but just kind of a rough definition. It's the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, decisions in an unconscious manner. That's implicit bias. Okay. And so, like I said, we'll get into each of these terms a little bit more specific as the session progresses. All right. So, the identity wheel. Did you all get a copy of the identity wheel? Yes. If not, I can post a link to it. That way you all can kind of get a glance at it. 1 second.
I started in my basement.
So I'm gonna post the link to it. Sorry, in the chat. Give me 1 second. I just gotta find the chat. You think by now I'd be able to navigate Zoom? There it is. All right, so I will give you all maybe, let's see, 4 minutes, 5 minutes. You're gonna look at the identity wheel and you're going to kind of fill out the circles around here, right? And so this is asking for your salient identities, and salient identities are the identities that are most visible to you at the time, right? And so you're gonna go through here and fill it out, and then there are questions along the side of the worksheet that I want you to kind of start thinking through which identities kind of come to mind when you think of those questions, okay? And so for me, I'll give an example of what filling out this bubble can look like. So for me, my race, I am Black. My gender identity, I identify as female. I am 29 years old. I know I look 23, but I'm 20. Actually, I'm not even 29. I'm sorry, I'm 28. And then you'll do your religion, your ability, education, origin, your work experience. And so this is like, your work experience is like, have you had to work, or, what was your family able to provide so that you didn't have to work? Are you a professional? Are you a student? Like, that's your work experience, okay? So I'll give you all a few minutes to fill that out and then start looking at the questions that are also on the worksheet. And then if you can't access the worksheet, also please let me know and I can make sure that you get access to it. All right, does anyone need a little bit more time or are we good to go? Give me a thumbs up if you're good. All right, I see 2 thumbs up. All right. So let's chat. Let's discuss. So how was filling this out for some of you all? Was this your first time doing an identity wheel? Have you ever had to think about your identities? What was kind of going through your minds as you were filling this out?
I guess I filled it out as maybe how people saw me or what's like, what do you do? Talking to another soccer mom type of thing. And I'm a mom of many, I'm a nurse, things like, first and foremost type of thing.
Okay. Anyone else? All right. So what are some of the identities that you think about most often? And again, remember, we're talking about social identities here. So the ones that are listed in the wheel that we have.
So the obvious, your race.
Yeah. Why do you think that you think about your race more often?
Because that's what you see.
Okay. Yep. That's what it's the first thing that a lot of people notice about you. Absolutely. Are there any on there that you think least about?
I try not to think about my age.
Anyone else want to share?
Probably the national origins, probably something I don't think too much about.
Okay. And why do you think that you think the least about it?
It probably just doesn't come up much day to day. I mean, it's definitely something that over time I think about. It's just probably out of like all the options on here, perhaps the least.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, there are some I'm like, I've never even considered this to be an identity that I hold. But there's something there in the fact that you don't have to think about it very often. And so are there any identities here that you feel like you hold privilege in? And anyone can share.
Maybe work experience or education.
Yeah, that can definitely be something. That's something that I think I have a privileged identity in too, is access to education. Anyone else?
I think ability is something that's a privilege, being able-bodied, minded.
Yes, 100%. And recently I was encouraged to use like temporarily able, right? Because we are all at the mercy of like life. So we're all like temporarily able. Absolutely. So do you think that there is a connection between your privilege identities and or just privilege in general and how often you think about certain identities?
Now that you ask it, I definitely see the correlation for sure, but I probably never would have thought of it on my own.
Yeah. Like we don't have to think about them because we hold privilege in them, whereas other people who may have a different identity, they think about it often because maybe that's an identity where they feel oppressed. So yeah, there's definitely privilege in those identities that we don't have to think about very often. So are there any identities that you hold that impact your relationship with your children as foster parents? None? No one has any identities that impact their relationships?
I think for me, socioeconomic class.
Okay.
I had a foster son who returned to his mom. And one of the things he said to us before he left, he's like, I'll never go on vacation again.
Mm.
Because we had taken him to Florida and, taken him to Disney. And it's very likely he will never go on a plane again.
Wow.
And that just like really, really hit me because my kids, have been on multiple vacations, and it's just, my husband and I work very hard for what we have, but we are privileged in that way.
Yeah. I'm glad that you are able to kind of understand in that moment. You maybe didn't recognize it prior to this, to the child bringing it up, but yeah, we all have privileges in different areas, and our identities, whether we can see it or not, they all kind of impact in little ways the work that we do. Are there any personal struggles that you all have in your role as parents, and you're working in working with children that have different identities than the ones that you hold?
Yeah, I think for me, I struggle with, if a child comes in that's not the same race as me,
Mm-hmm.
and what that experience might have been before they came to me.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe what household they came in, what the thinking pattern was of the people that they lived with. So you kind of, I kind of tiptoe around it, but, I struggle with that a lot.
Okay. Hopefully we'll be able to kind of talk through some ways we can have those difficult conversations today. So thank you for sharing. And what was your name? I'm sorry.
Mary.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Mary.
Oh, hi, Mary. Okay, perfect. Yes. Well, hopefully we can work through those difficult conversations. So thank you for sharing, Mary. Is there anyone else who has some struggles with the identities that they hold and the identities that their children hold?
I've also run into race with the same little boy I was talking about. We're actually adopting his sister in the next few months. But I'm very white and my husband's Italian. So he's, especially during the summer, a lot darker.
Mm-hmm.
And and he came up to me, this little boy came up to me, put his hand next to mine. He goes, "We are not the same."
Mm-hmm.
He's like, "Peter and I are the same, but you and I aren't the same."
Yeah. And so one thing we know is that the children can see the differences that we have. And so sometimes we want to, it's often easy for us to avoid the conversations. But one thing that I'm learning is that it's likely for us, the uncomfortability for us to have those conversations versus for them, because they are seeing the different things that are happening around them and they are looking for explanations. And so they desire these conversations, though they may be difficult. It kind of helps them understand the world around them because they can definitely, they definitely see it. All right. Anyone else have anything to share about their identities and the struggles that they hold in their relationships with their children? If not, we can go on to the next area. So the purpose of this is so that we in understanding bias, we have to kind of understand the identities that we hold and how they can shape the bias that we have. And so that's kind of why we started with this activity, because you really can't understand how you view the world if you don't understand the identities that you hold. So hopefully this activity was helpful for you in understanding your different identities, especially those areas that you have privilege in. And if you can't see the privilege that you have right now, I challenge you to just kind of reflect a little bit more on those, especially on those identities that you don't really think more often of, and ask yourself how you may hold privilege through that identity. All right, so we're gonna move into bias. So there are two types of bias, right? In general, bias is our brain's ability to like create shortcuts, because we process so many things at one time. There's no way our brain can like process each thing like it's a brand new thing every time. So we create shortcuts, and that's kind of where bias comes in. So unconscious bias is hidden or implicit preference for or against a person, thing, or group without deliberation. So it's unconscious. We don't really think about it and how it affects our actions. Conscious is very overt, explicit attitude or prejudice that we endorse knowingly, right? And so think about it like your unconscious bias, it lives back here in the back of your brain, right? So it's there, you just don't really notice how it affects you, but definitely does. It lives back here. But your conscious bias is right here. It's at the front. You see it, you act on it deliberately. That is your conscious bias, right? Does everyone understand the difference between the two? Okay, perfect. So there's also an implicit bias test, which I mentioned earlier. And if you haven't had an opportunity to take it, I think I should be able to give you a few minutes for those of you who didn't get the test earlier. But there is the most commonly used test is the one, the Harvard test. It's the implicit association test through Project Implicit at Harvard University. There are lots of implicit bias tests out there. So just know that like this isn't the only test that's out there, and there are different critiques for all of the different tests. And I encourage you, on Harvard's website, there are multiple types of bias that you can hold. There's like race bias, gender, all of those identities that we just talked about. You can hold bias for each of those identities. And so if you have some time, I do recommend just kind of clicking through those tests and understanding a little bit more about what those different biases look like. So I do have a quick video for you all today to kind of set the tone for bias. And then after we watch the video, we will chat a little bit more about bias in depth, okay? All right, let's see.
At the Kirwan Institute for
Can
the
you all
Study of
hear?
Race and Ethnicity, our goal is to create a just and inclusive society where all people and communities have the opportunity to succeed. One of the primary barriers to this goal we recognize is the impact of implicit bias, which refers to unconscious attitudes and stereotypes that can influence our decision-making, even if we're not aware of it. In this video, we explore how implicit bias affects crucial decisions that determine what pathways are available to individuals. The purpose is to illustrate that unconscious barriers present on these pathways can ultimately alter one's entire life trajectory. We'll start by looking at education. Studies tell us that teachers form different expectations and perceptions of students' behavior based on race. For example, one study showed that teachers rated the same student behavior, imaginative play, as indicative of positive outcomes for white preschoolers and negative outcomes for Black preschoolers. This is important because it demonstrates the implicit use of race as a lens to evaluate students' behavior. Similarly, another research study focusing on school discipline showed teachers were more likely to implicitly view negative behavior as a persistent pattern for Black students, while teachers were more likely to believe negative behaviors were an isolated incident when the student was white. Added together, these instances of the operation of implicit bias can create a staggering amount of adversity for students of color. Yet, these instances of biased expectations are just the tip of the iceberg. We also know that a history of racial disparity in education is evident in research on academic preparedness, disability diagnosis, and discipline outcomes, all of which can derail students' trajectories toward high school graduation and eventually higher education. Like other multi-stage processes, gaining access to higher education has many decision points during which implicit bias may influence outcomes. For example, one study examined how likely professors were to reply to an email from a potential graduate school applicant to discuss the program. The emails sent to various institutions were identical, except information identifying the race and gender of the applicant. The study showed that regardless of the type of program, white males were the most likely to get a response to the email. The race or the gender of the advisor had no impact on these outcomes. What this study illustrates are important points of implicit discrimination in the higher education process that can go unnoticed. These informal communications aren't tracked or evaluated by the university. Thus, because implicit bias is unconscious, professors likely don't know when they exhibit implicit favoritism. It's not that they're malintentioned, but the effects for the applicants are nevertheless meaningful and can affect their academic trajectory. Now, consider the culmination of these differences at different decision points within the pathway to opportunity. By now, many students of color who have experienced implicit or overt discrimination at these junctions may have opted out of pursuing higher education altogether. But for those that remain, familiar barriers exist. These include lower expectations, stereotype threat, and lack of social support, to name a few. For those individuals who overcome the implicit biases they face during their academic careers, there are still hurdles to overcome when entering the workforce. A primary example is the effect of implicit bias on hiring managers' perceptions of resume quality and candidates' competency. We know through several experiments that individuals are more likely to evaluate work materials as higher quality when coming from a white male. In fact, one study even demonstrated that evaluators detected fewer errors when proofreading a writing sample from a white author versus an identical writing sample perceived to be written by a Black author. Not only does implicit bias create barriers for many individuals to enter the workforce, but it can also affect internal workplace dynamics. For example, implicit biases affect people's perceptions of leadership skills and reveal the tendency to implicitly associate men with careers and women with staying at home. This is one example from a growing body of research that demonstrates how individuals' perceptions regarding the workforce and economy are impacted by implicit bias. Consider the impact of all of these barriers at once. This compounding effect certainly creates a very different picture of the American dream than what most of us hold to be true. Instead, it paints a reality where significant barriers exist for some groups, while significant advantages exist for others, all of which may be the result of unconscious dynamics. By looking at the lifelong impact of implicit bias at these gateways, we can understand why the notion of picking oneself up by their bootstraps just doesn't hold after facing so many instances of unconscious discrimination. Instead, we need a comprehensive view of structural equity that is also informed by our understanding of implicit bias. Human decision-making and structures of discrimination are two sides of the same coin. Both must be considered simultaneously to break down these barriers to equity in order to ensure all those living in our country can have a fulfilling, opportunity-filled life.
All right. So, just a little crash course on implicit bias and how it can manifest in different systems within our society. So, what are some thoughts on that video? Anything that kind of come to mind? Or anything you noticed in the video?
I guess the part that they just said that the implicit bias, whether it's well intent, ill intended or not, it doesn't matter. The outcome is the same for the person that's receiving the bias.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we do that, we have to kind of be mindful of our reaction to someone saying that we caused harm in that way.
Mhm.
Yep. Anything else? What else did we notice from the video?
I heard towards the end that, even though the opportunities might be the same, person who's getting the implicit bias is like pushed down with their expectations. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I can
And it's
see
like
that.
a system of being pushed down, like in different sectors of a society, people who are victims of implicit bias. It's kind of like a building effect. And so we have to kind of wonder what we can do on our level to negate some of those things. Anyone else have any thoughts about the video? All right. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about the implicit bias test, and show of hands, who had opportunity to take the test, or if you could just maybe pop it in the chat if you did or did not take the implicit bias test. Okay, so Beth, I see you did. Might be the only one. So since not a lot of people had the opportunity to, I was planning for us to take a break after this discussion, but I'll just move the break to before, and I'll give you all a little bit more time to take the test, and I will post the link to it in the chat. Give me 1 second. All right, so when you go onto the website, you're gonna have to like put in a little bit of your info, and there's like a pre-questionnaire, and then the test that you all are taking is the race IAT, and it should take, like I said, 5 to 7 minutes. And so I'll give you all let's see, a 15-minute break, and go to the restroom, do personal things, and then we will come back. Let's see, it is 8:11. So, I have to do math on my calculator. Let's see. Let's come back at 8:26. Okay. Sound good? All right. All right. Well, I hope you all are refreshed in those 15 minutes. And hopefully you all had an opportunity to take the implicit bias test. Um, Wendy, are you able to create breakout rooms? Oh, you're muted. I can't tell if you're.
Sorry, yes, I can.
Oh, perfect. So we are going to go into breakout rooms, and I have a few questions here for you all to consider, just in a smaller group. You know, if you got your results back, were you surprised? Why or why not? What are some steps we can take to unlearn your bias? And then, you know, what can be some consequences, right, of not unlearning our bias? Who will be impacted by us not working to unlearn our bias? And, you know, keep in mind that, like, we all have bias. Every single one of us has bias. It is, again, our brain's ability to make shortcuts. It's just how we, once we're aware of our unconscious bias, what are we going to do about unlearning it, right? So, which is why we're here today. So, you know, if you got your results back and it wasn't something necessarily agree with, just understanding that this is a learning process and we're all imperfect people. But now that we are aware of these things, like what can we do to make a shift? So, you're going to go into your breakout rooms and have these questions. Feel free to like take a picture of the screen with the questions on there, because I didn't send these questions out. These questions, I sent the other ones. So, but again, were you surprised by your results? Why or why not? What are some steps you can take to unlearn your bias, and who can be impacted if you are not, and what the consequences of that can be? Okay, and we'll do breakout rooms for about, we'll do like 7 minutes. Wendy, if you want to set the timer, you can do like 7 minutes. And then when you're in your group, elect a spokesperson, because when we come back, we're going to share out. And so have a spokesperson prepared to kind of share what your group talked about. Okay.
So are we going to, I know you had some extra people on here.
Oh yeah, so you can leave Faustina out of the breakout rooms.
And I also think that perhaps Ashley is still in here too. It looks like that 508 number.
Okay. You can,
So,
uh-huh.
That's me. That's
okay.
Mary.
Okay. All right. So then I'll just assign automatically and we'll just include them. Okay.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm. I think it actually worked out perfect because you and Faustina ended up in a group together. I think you're on mute. Mhm.
But is there someone else in that room by themselves?
Nope, it's just the two of you.
Oh, perfect. Perfect.
But I
And then
am
if you want to
gonna-
join a breakout room, you're absolutely free to. I counted you in the numbers. So it actually might be great if you could join a breakout room.
It didn't give me an option to pick like a pre-recorded amount of time.
Oh, it's okay. I can set a timer.
Okay. So I'm seeing that Beth looks like she's in by herself, so I'm gonna go ahead and join that group.
Okay, and then actually, I don't have the ability to bring everybody back. So are you able to?
Yeah, I'll
Okay,
try to. Okay.
cool. See you soon.
Okay.
All right, so looks like everybody is back. So let's chat. What did you all chat about? Did you all elect a spokesperson for your room? Let's hear what you all discussed.
I did forget to do the spokesperson, but I didn't take the survey because I didn't have the survey, but Beth had some good insight. She kind of thought that the survey was it just was different than she expected, but we were both saying that it was just interesting to see the bias that we weren't even aware of. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. The test is tricky, but it's like intentionally that way. You're like, oh, I wasn't even trying to, do that. But that's the whole point, is that like
Yeah,
it's
that's what she was saying. She couldn't see where was this going? Like, what was this going to be? Like, yeah, it was different than what she was expecting.
yeah, absolutely. What's the other group? How many groups were there too?
Yeah, I think there might have done two. Yeah.
All right. What did the other group discuss?
I was in a group by myself.
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm so
I
sorry.
am
That's
sorry.
okay.
I thought it looked like there was someone in there with you, but maybe the person that was in there just wasn't
Yeah,
participating.
the phone number is me.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So there's two. You're on here twice for me. You're on as Mary and there's a phone number. Gotcha.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, Mary. I would have joined in with you.
No, it's fine. It's fine. So what I realize is that I like Black people more than I like European Americans. Like I guess that I don't know if that was the questions. I think were odd. It's almost like it's not expected for a Black person to take the test. And I know that I have unconscious bias, so just kind of it was odd answering questions about Black people when I am Black.
Yeah. But I guess it's supposed to show you that like you are biased against other races. Because when I took the test, I had similar results. I was like, oh, I'm biased against I hold a bias for my own people, but it's like a preference basically. And so it's
Right.
supposed to show you that you may hold bias against other races. Yes, I had similar results. So I guess if Mary was in a group Mary, you also show up as two different people on my screen too. So maybe that's why we apologize. We'll fix it for the next.
Yeah, my internet isn't stable, so I call in so that I can hear. I don't drop anything.
Perfect sense. Yeah, because I can hear you coming from the other thing, but totally fine. All right. So did you all have opportunity to reflect on, how you can unlearn your bias? No. Well, it's okay. We'll get more into that. This is mostly a preliminary conversation, so we'll get a little bit more into it in our next conversation. So in the last 20 minutes, we're going to talk about the cycle of socialization. And give me 1 second. I have to find my screen again. It always gets lost. There we go. All right, so where does our bias come from? Question mark. So this is the cycle of socialization, and it's got a lot of words on there. And so what I'm gonna do, instead of kind of talking through and reading each of these words that are on the screen, I'm gonna give you an example of the cycle of socialization, right? So does everyone have an understanding of what socialization means? It's essentially the process of learning to behave a certain way based off of society and societal norms. And we all can find ourselves somewhere in this cycle. but the goal is to break out of it, right? So I'll start with an example about gender. So you're immediately thrown into the cycle because even before you're born, the cycle, the systems already exist, right? So when you think about babies, a lot of emphasis is put on like the gender, like, oh, is it going to be a girl or is it going to be a boy? And, you know, the parents usually decorate the room based off what they believe the gender of the baby might be. And so you're born into a world where things already exist, no consciousness, no choice, no choice. You're just kind of born into that, and you're immediately thrown into the cycle. So the first arrow is the fact that, you know, again, socialization begins immediately. You're given a pink blanket if you're a girl, or you're given a fun blue outfit if you are a boy. And this is enforced by, you know, our parents, our relatives, our teachers. We're learned, you know, we're taught, you know, how girls should behave, how boys should behave. We're taught these things by different people in our lives, kind of shown here in this first part of this first socialization. Then these influences are also given throughout like institutional structure. So I mentioned school, but also like church practices, the media. They are all influences on how we should behave within our different identities. And these are how these institutions kind of shape that socialization. So then the second arrow, again, is how that's enforced, right? Like girls are supposed to dress this way, boys are supposed to dress this way. You're supposed to, if you're girly, you're supposed to, you know, play with your Barbie dolls, or if you're boys, you're supposed to, you know, play with toys and Hot Wheels and things like that. And you're shown what the consequence of that could be if you were to go in the opposite direction. So, you know, you're told like, oh, you're not being respectful, or you're being too girly if you're a boy and you want to play with the Barbie doll, or you're being too feminine, quote unquote feminine. And so you see what the consequences can be of these things if you are to act different from what society expects from you, right? So the results of that are what we kind of end up being, and kind of the way that we see ourselves, which for some of us, and if we have an identity that is a marginalized identity, that can end in you know, violence, self-hatred, anger, because you see, you know, how society wants you to be, and you see the privileged identity that exists, and maybe you don't hold that identity. And so you kind of have this negative perception of yourself or of the identities that you hold. So here in this part of the cycle is where you kind of decide like, am I going to break the cycle, or am I going to continue in the cycle, right? So I was thinking about like, you know, I like playing outside, right? I'm a girl, and, you know, girls aren't supposed to be rough. You know, I was seen as like a tomboy, but like, I don't care about that. Like, I'm Talaya, I'm a human being. I'm going to break the cycle and not continue to do what society expects of me. And so you kind of have a choice here, because the rest of this is like within, it's not really within your control. But once you get to this part of the cycle, you have an option to change or to continue into that cycle. Now, I will say there are a few exceptions to why you might stay within the cycle. So I think about members of like the LGBTQIA community, and like maybe consequences could be like harm for maybe coming out or things like that. Or for the transgender community, we see a lot of hatred and violent acts towards that community. And so maybe for self-preservation, in that way, you might continue into this cycle. But for the most part, you should want to break the cycle. And there's another cycle that exists. It's the cycle of liberation. It's a totally different conversation, but I do challenge you, if you want to learn more about the cycle of socialization liberation, to look it up. If you just Google cycle of liberation, there's a whole process of how you can be liberated and create change for other people who might hold similar identities to yours. So does anyone have any questions about the cycle of socialization, kind of understanding how we are kind of shaped from the beginning. And this is where our bias comes from. Any questions? No. Alrighty. So we don't have a whole lot of time left. So we'll just discuss some of these things out loud, right? So again, thinking about our bias that we hold, sometimes I'll go to the second question here. Sometimes it's hard to know whether we have acted on our bias or been a target of it. So does anyone have an example where you feel like you might have acted on your bias or were a target of it, and kind of what were you feeling in that moment, or how did you respond?
It's one of those tricky questions. I'm sure it happens all the time. And it's just when you put on the spot, I can't think of anything.
And there are no wrong answers, right? Like we're all a safe space. So I can think of an example of a time when I know I was a target of implicit bias. So for me, I'm a Black woman, and there's a book, and I'll share it at the end of the session that I was reading. And there's this thing called the other race effect, and how we are groomed to have a favor towards people who look like us, as we were talking about earlier. And someone mistook me for someone else, and it was because they thought that I was them. And it's just because we were the only two Black women that lived in the building. And so they mistook me for that other person. And so that is a form of implicit bias and thinking that like all Black women look alike. So that's where I know I was a target of bias. So that's just one example. Can anyone think of any other examples where they were a target or where they acted on their implicit bias? And it's okay to share. Again, we all have bias.
Yeah, I think for me, again, a target of it. When I first moved to Massachusetts, I was looking for an apartment, and there was an apartment in Cambridge, and I didn't know anybody, so I went with a white guy from my job. We called, and the landlord said, "Come right over, and the apartment, is ready if you want to look at it." And when I got there, and he saw me, he said the apartment was rented, but there was a basement apartment available. And we, the guy that I was with didn't catch it. He was just like, "But we just called you and made an appointment to come over." And he was like, "I know that, these apartments go pretty fast." And when he showed us the basement, it was literally behind the boiler. And I was like, first of all, why would you put a woman down here? And second of all, why would you think that I would want to, live here? And my thought the whole time was that it was Cambridge and it's going to be okay, and I think for me, that was the first taste, because where I was from, I didn't really have this issue, but it was the first taste of being a target of the bias, and just being aware that, it doesn't matter how educated or how well dressed or where you work, and I think I said this in the beginning, that your face is it. And I think, as we look at foster children, we have to remember that, when, you have a child of a different race and you're taking them out in public, people are making, decisions based on what they see, not necessarily that you're a good person and, you're doing the right thing. They're looking at this kid and thinking, whatever they're thinking. But, so that's my example.
Thank you. I appreciate you for sharing. And it's interesting when you're a target, you're like, because you almost want to second guess yourself, like, now, was that what I thought it was? And yes, the answer is always yes. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that. And I also thank you for that segue. We're going to move on because I have a few questions I want us to kind of focus on to kind of bring the conversation back to your relationship with your foster children. And so now that we kind of have a good understanding of like our identities that we hold, and then the implicit bias that we also hold congruently, how can you like utilize this information in your day-to-day interactions with your children?
I think if I can, you can't ignore it. Like, don't ignore it, and don't, you know, I have a girlfriend who always says, well, I don't see color. Well, I want you to see my color. Like, I don't want you to not see me. You know, don't ignore it. Don't, you know, like, you know, we look different, but we love the same. You know, I think that, you know, as we interact with foster children, we have to, and it goes both ways, right? It's not, you know, you with me with a black child, it's me with a white child also, that, you know, we love the same, and we have to, you know, embrace it. And just, I think it's all about awareness.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I have a note here. I'm really glad that you said that. A colorblind approach is not, it's not okay, right? Like, you need to see color, because when you don't see color, you don't see the discrimination that is held by the color of a person's skin. And it, like you said, Mary, it absolutely goes both ways. Like, you want to acknowledge the differences, and you want to teach your children, like, yes, there are people out there who look different than us. They also have different experiences than us, and you allow it to be a learning conversation about, you know, cultural differences and cultural appreciation in those ways. So yes. Anyone else have a thought on how you can utilize this information in your day-to-day interactions? And if not, the second question is a little bit more important, of like, what can you do now to create an environment that makes it natural for your children to talk about the identities that they hold? And again, it goes beyond race, right? We talk about like ability status, we talk about class status, everything that we mentioned with our social identities. How can you create a space where they're comfortable having those conversations with you and asking questions and inquiring more?
I think it's like what Mary said, is not like not talking about it, by celebrating it, by making it natural, by making it something that is just a normal part of your day, to not avoid it. It's not something that's like, you know, a bad subject that we don't talk about. It's something that's talked about and celebrated and encouraged. Opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And if there's an identity that you don't maybe have understanding of, there are people around you who are willing to support you. There are resources out there. There are lots of different books and things like that. You know, I think it's on us to kind of do the work and educate ourselves, the way we can best support those people that it matters to the most. And so, yes, thank you, Wendy. Anyone else? It's also important to have a note here about like being like a white savior. So we see it in movies all the time, right? Like, just, you know, don't try to like cure racism or cure, you know, ableism. Like, those things exist. You just have to do your role as an individual for your human beings that you are responsible for, and try not to make it about you. Because I think when you think about white saviors, it makes it about the person and not about the people that they're impacting. And so just kind of keeping that in mind as well. So in our last 4 minutes, I want us to create some action steps. And you don't have to say these out loud, but I do want you to consider the following 2 questions. You could pop them in the chat, or you can share them out loud if you want to. But, you know, what's one thing that you're gonna commit to today as it relates to supporting children with different identities, different from yours? And what additional steps can you take to learn more, right? Because as I mentioned, this is not the end of the conversation. This is a very introductory conversation. So what can you do today or in the future to kind of make sure that you're continuing the learning about implicit and explicit bias?
I thought that visual was really helpful about understanding where the implicit bias or even the explicit bias comes from, about tracing it back and taking a moment to like think about where does this bias come from? Like, why do I feel this way and where does it come from? And how can I change its path?
Yeah. And, take that cycle and think about every single identity that you hold, kind of how we did the identity wheel, and kind of think through like, okay, where did I get this from? What societal influences are there that are pushing these messages forward? And think about your privileged identities and also think about your oppressed identities as well, and kind of think about that results area and kind of where you landed there in the cycle and how you're going to break through. And I really, again, challenge you all to look up the cycle of liberation. It's literally the next page in the cycle, but it's a whole process. I felt like we should probably start with the socialization cycle first, but highly encourage you to look up the cycle of liberation as well. So let's see. Anybody else? And again, put it in the chat if you want to, but I would like for everyone to share an action step that they're going to take from after this session.
I think it's important to just continue the conversation. We have friends, we have family members that, may not understand. And I think it's really important to just continue the conversation because, I think you started off, Talaya, saying, this isn't about blame. This is about learning. And if the more we learn, the better the experience for the kids. I was listening to a TED Talk yesterday, and we were talking about colorblind, and the woman was saying, "Don't be colorblind, be color brave." And I thought that was really impactful. But I think it's the more we talk about it, the more comfortable we're going to become with the conversation. But learning is probably the best part of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And conversations are difficult, right? Like, let's name that. They're difficult for us, they're difficult for the person on the receiving end, but they're absolutely necessary. And so discomfort is not always a bad thing. Like, let's lean into that discomfort and also challenge yourself to ask yourself, why does this conversation make me uncomfortable? And maybe there's some privilege there that you hold that you might have to kind of unpack and figuring out why those conversations are uncomfortable. But once you do that, that should hopefully get you to a place where you have some self-realization. And then that would also help you, have that conversation and being transparent and saying, yeah, I realize I am struggling in this area, but we can learn together, So we are right at time. I wanted to, share a few references. There's a book I read in preparation for this session and also for my class. It's called Bias: Uncovering the Hidden Prejudice That Shapes What We See, Think, and Do. Very good book. And it has so many different references to different social scientific studies that the author did about bias. And it's not just racial bias. It talks about bias against other religions and the homeless community. And so highly recommend that book. It was really eye-opening for me, and a little bit, I had to sit with it for a while. I had to do some self-reflection too. And so highly recommend. So yeah, that's me. And then here's my email address. If you think of anything, you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And yeah, that's all. Thanks for having me. Thanks for being willing participants today. I appreciate you all for sharing your experiences. And I do hope that you learned a little bit something. And yeah, thank you all.
Thanks, Talaya. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Could I
you.
ask a quick question? Can you put the last slide up that had the book name? on it, please? Thank you. Oh,
Oh.
no. Thank you.
No problem.
Just taking a
Yeah,
picture. of it.
it's biased. Oh, I had it. I had it. What did I do with it?
Okay. Thank you.
Biased.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No problem. No problem.
Good night.
Right.
Night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.